Medical Officer Sarah Chin stood before her class at the Galactic Medical Academy, facing 30 pairs of alien eyes, some compound, some multifaceted, some bioluminescent, all fixed on her with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The Academy's pristine white walls reflected the soft blue lighting designed to accommodate the various species' visual sensitivities. This was her first semester teaching emergency medical protocols, a human perspective, and she knew exactly how this lesson would go. Today, she announced, pulling on a pair of standard medical gloves, we're going to learn about human emergency first aid techniques. I must warn you, what you're about to see might seem extreme by your standards. A Zalaxian student in the front row, their crystalline appendages clicking nervously, raised a translucent limb. Instructor Chin, we've reviewed the curriculum outline. Surely there must be some mistake about the direct pressure technique. Sarah smiled, having heard this question in every introductory class. No mistake, Crix. When humans encounter severe bleeding, we apply direct pressure to the wound. Sometimes, we even have to reach inside to pinch blood vessels closed. A collective shudder ran through the classroom. The Morlocks in the back row changed color from their usual pale green to a sickly yellow, their tentacles curling in distress. But that's barbaric, exclaimed Trinlox, a Viridian whose exoskeleton plates were rattling with horror. What about cellular regeneration fields? Stasis bubbles? Even basic quantum coagulation? Sarah picked up a roll of gauze from her medical kit. Those are excellent tools when available. But humans evolved on a death world where we had to stop bleeding with whatever was at hand. Sometimes that meant using cloth, leaves, or even our own hands. We learned to survive without advanced technology, and these methods still save lives today. She projected a hologram showing human circulatory system. Our bodies are remarkably resilient. We can lose up to 40% of our blood volume and survive with proper treatment. Our blood clots naturally, our wounds heal through granulation, and our bones knit themselves back together. What you call barbaric is actually an elegant system developed through millions of years of evolution. The class watched in fascinated horror as she demonstrated bandaging techniques on a medical mannequin. When she showed them how to make a tourniquet from available materials, several students had to engage their species' equivalent of anti-nausea protocols. But there's more, Sarah continued, bringing out the next teaching aid. Sometimes we have to physically seal wounds with heat. Heat, squeaked a Photarian student, their bioluminescent spots flashing in distress. You cauterize your own species? In extreme circumstances, yes. We also stitch wounds closed with needle and thread, set broken bones by physically manipulating them, and perform emergency procedures without anesthesia when necessary. The classroom erupted in a cacophony of alarmed clicks, whistles, and electromagnetic pulses, the universal sound of alien species processing something that challenged their worldview. Sarah raised her hand for silence. I know this seems shocking. But consider this. Humans have survived and thrived without access to advanced medical technology for most of our history. These techniques you find so primitive? They're the reason we made it to the stars. She pulled up another hologram, this time showing historical footage of emergency responders working at a disaster site. This is why the Galactic Council mandated this course. Humans are often first responders in crisis situations across the galaxy. When your sophisticated medical equipment fails, when you're stranded on a primitive world, or when you're facing a mass casualty event, these barbaric techniques might save your life or the lives of your crew. A quantum hivemind representative raised its primary consciousness node. Query: how do humans overcome the psychological barrier of causing additional pain to help others? Sarah's expression softened. That's an excellent question. It's not easy. Every human medical professional struggles with this. But we understand that sometimes, to save a life, we must cause temporary discomfort. It's part of our medical oath. First, do no harm doesn't mean cause no pain. It means making difficult choices to ensure survival. She began distributing practice bandages to the class. Today, you'll learn the basics of pressure bandaging. Yes, you'll have to touch the simulation wounds. Yes, it will feel uncomfortable. But remember, in a real emergency, these skills might be all that stands between life and death. As the students reluctantly began practicing with their bandages, Sarah noticed something changing in their expressions. Beyond the initial shock and disgust, there was a growing appreciation for the resilience of humanity. These aliens were beginning to understand why humans were often called the Deathworlders, not because they were violent or primitive, but because they had learned to survive against all odds. Remember, she concluded, watching her students awkwardly attempt their first bandaging techniques, advanced technology is wonderful, but the best medical tools are the ones you have with you when you need them. Sometimes, that's just your hands, your knowledge, and your will to save a life. The lesson continued, and gradually, the alien students began to adapt to these strange human methods. They were taking their first steps toward understanding that sometimes, the most primitive solutions were also the most reliable. And in the vast, unpredictable expanse of space, reliability could mean the difference between life and death. 2 weeks into the emergency medical training course, the Galactic Medical Academy's simulation chamber hummed with nervous energy. Medical Officer Sarah Chin had configured the room to replicate the aftermath of a mining accident, complete with environmental hazards and multiple casualties requiring immediate attention. The alien students stood at the ready, their medical kits clutched in various appendages, watching as the simulation materialized around them. Remember, Sarah called out over the growing sounds of emergency sirens, your advanced medical devices are offline. You have only basic supplies and your training. This is a common scenario in frontier territories. The chamber transformed into a dimly lit tunnel system, holographic dust filling the air. Sophisticated mannequins, designed to simulate various species' anatomies and injuries, lay scattered throughout the scene. The mannequins could bleed, display vital signs, and respond to treatment, making them perfect for hands-on training. Crix, the Zalaxian student, approached the first casualty, a humanoid mannequin with a severe leg injury. The crystalline being's appendages trembled as they opened their medical kit. Instructor Chin, this simulation is producing actual red fluid. That's correct, Sarah replied, watching carefully. You need to experience the reality of treating blood-based life forms. Now, what's your first step? The Zalaxian's crystalline structure flickered with anxiety, but they remembered their training. Assess the bleeding type. This appears to be bright red and rhythmic, arterial bleeding. Good observation. Now apply what you learned. Crix reached for the gauze with shaking appendages. Around them, other students were facing similar challenges with their own simulation casualties. A group of Morlocks worked together to treat a chest wound, their tentacles carefully coordinating to maintain pressure while preparing bandages. Trinlox, the Viridian with the chattering exoskeleton, called out in alarm. The human casualty's blood pressure is dropping. The manual techniques aren't working fast enough. Sarah moved swiftly to their station. Remember your training. What do humans do when standard pressure isn't enough? The Viridian's compound eyes widened. We have to reach in? With our appendages. Their exoskeleton plates clattered with increased intensity. Correct. In this case, you need to locate the damaged vessel and compress it directly. Every moment of hesitation costs precious blood. The entire class watched as Trinlox, fighting against every instinct, carefully inserted their sterilized appendage into the simulated wound. The mannequin's vital signs immediately began to stabilize. Excellent work, Sarah commended. Sometimes the most effective solution is the most direct one. This is why human emergency medicine seems brutal to many species. We do what works, even if it isn't pleasant. A Photarian student working on another casualty suddenly emitted intense distress signals. Instructor, the bleeding has soaked through 3 layers of gauze. In our medical tradition, we would never continue applying pressure. It goes against all principles of energy flow and harmonic healing. Sarah moved to demonstrate, her gloved hands firmly pressing down on the soaked bandages. Add more gauze on top, don't remove the soaked layers. The blood-soaked material actually helps form a better clot. Remember, human medicine isn't about harmony, it's about survival. The quantum hive-mind representatives worked in perfect synchronization, their multiple bodies coordinating to treat several casualties at once. Query: The human approach prioritizes immediate survival over long-term cellular harmony. Assessment. This reflects the species' evolutionary path. Observation. Effectiveness cannot be denied, despite methods appearing crude. As the simulation progressed, Sarah noticed a subtle shift in her students' approach. Their initial horror at human medical techniques was giving way to a grudging appreciation for their effectiveness. The Morlocks had stopped changing color at the sight of blood. The Zalaxians' crystalline appendages moved with more confidence. Even the Viridians' exoskeletons had settled into a less anxious rattling pattern. "Time's up," Sarah announced as the simulation began to fade. "Let's review your performance." She pulled up the vital statistics of their simulated patients. 8 out of 10 casualties stabilized. That's a significant improvement from last week's 4 out of 10. The students gathered around, their various sensory organs focused on the data displays. Many were still covered in simulated blood, their medical supplies depleted, but there was a new sense of accomplishment in their postures. "You're beginning to understand," Sarah continued, "that emergency medicine isn't about elegance or technological sophistication. It's about doing whatever is necessary to keep someone alive until they can reach definitive care. Humans learned this through countless generations of trial and error on our death world. We didn't have the luxury of waiting for ideal conditions or perfect solutions." The Photarian students' bioluminescent spots pulsed thoughtfully. "I believe I understand now. What we perceived as brutality is actually pragmatism born of necessity." "Exactly," Sarah smiled. "And that pragmatism has saved countless lives across the galaxy. Next week, we'll move on to even more challenging scenarios. Until then, I want you all to practice basic bandaging techniques until you can do them without hesitation." As the students filed out of the simulation chamber, Sarah overheard snippets of their conversations. They were discussing the merits of different pressure techniques, debating the best angles for wound packing, and even sharing tips about overcoming their species-specific aversions to direct contact with bodily fluids. She made a note in her teaching log, students beginning to adapt to human medical methodologies. Initial cultural shock giving way to practical appreciation. Survival instincts transcend species boundaries. When faced with life or death situations, all beings can learn to do what must be done. The explosion in the Academy's engineering lab shook the entire medical wing. Sarah Chin was reviewing trauma protocols with her class when the emergency alerts blared through the facility's communication system. The artificial gravity fluctuated momentarily, sending several students floating before the backup systems engaged. "This is not a drill," the Academy's AI announced. "Medical emergency in Engineering Lab Delta. Multiple casualties reported. All medical personnel respond immediately." Sarah's students looked at her with their various sensory organs, a mixture of fear and uncertainty evident in their postures. This wasn't a simulation. This was real. "Remember your training," Sarah commanded, already grabbing her emergency kit. "Cricks, Trinlocks, gather all available supplies. Morlock team, bring the portable stasis units, if they're working. Everyone else, form response teams of 3. Move." The class sprung into action, their previous training overriding their instinctive hesitations. They rushed through the corridors, following the emergency guidance systems toward Engineering Lab Delta. The acrid smell of burned circuitry and plasma discharge grew stronger as they approached. The scene that greeted them was chaos. A failed containment field had resulted in a cascade of explosions across the lab. 3 human engineers and 2 Arcturian technicians lay injured among the smoking debris. Most of the lab's advanced medical equipment had been fried by the plasma discharge. "Assessment teams, go," Sarah ordered, her students spreading out across the lab. "Remember, when technology fails, we fall back on basics. Trust your training." Cricks approached the nearest human casualty, their crystalline appendages steady despite the emergency. Male human, conscious but showing signs of shock. Multiple lacerations and plasma burns across torso. Bleeding is significant. The Zalaxian didn't hesitate this time, immediately applying pressure bandages to the worst of the wounds. The human engineer grimaced but remained still, watching with interest as the crystalline being worked. Across the lab, the Morlock team encountered a more severe case. One of the Arcturian technicians had a piece of equipment embedded in their primary respiratory chamber. The Morlock's tentacles moved with practiced precision, stabilizing the foreign object while applying pressure to the surrounding tissue. The Arcturian's bioreadings are critical, one of the Morlocks called out. Our standard protocols would require a full quantum stabilization field. We don't have that option, Sarah reminded them as she moved between patients. What's your backup plan? The Morlocks exchanged quick looks before one of them reached for the basic medical kit. Manual pressure and physical stabilization, human style. It's not elegant, but it should work. Trinlox and the Photarian student worked together on another human engineer who had suffered a compound fracture. The sight of exposed bone would have sent them into panic modes just weeks ago. Now, they methodically cleaned the wound, applied traction, and began splinting the limb. Fascinating adaptation of primitive techniques, the quantum hivemind representatives observed as they coordinated supply distribution. Effectiveness ratio comparable to advanced methods in emergency situations. Updating assessment protocols. A secondary explosion rocked the lab, showering them with sparks. Sarah watched as her students maintained their positions, continuing to treat their patients despite the danger. They had come so far from their first horrified reactions to human medical practices. Additional medical teams are deploying from Central, the Academy AI announced. Estimated arrival, 12 minutes. We don't need to wait, Sarah called out. You're doing exactly what needs to be done. Keep going. The Viridian student, working on plasma burns, clicked their mandibles thoughtfully. These human methods, they're not just about medical treatment, are they? They're about adapting, about finding ways to continue when technology and comfort fail us. Sarah nodded as she helped stabilize another patient. That's exactly right. Humans learned medicine through necessity, but we learned something else too, the will to keep going, to save lives even when it means getting our hands dirty. The next 10 minutes were intense but focused. When the additional medical teams arrived with their advanced equipment, they found all 5 casualties successfully stabilized through what they would consider primitive methods. The human patients were conscious and stable, while the Arcturians' vital signs had normalized despite the severity of their injuries. As the professional medical team took over, Sarah gathered her students in a quiet corner of the lab. They were covered in various bodily fluids, their medical supplies depleted, but there was a new confidence in their bearing. Today, you proved something, she told them. Not just to me, but to yourselves. When the advanced technology failed, when you faced real injuries and real danger, you didn't freeze. You didn't wait for better options. You used what you had, and you saved lives. The Photarians' bioluminescent spots pulsed with pride. We performed human medicine. No, Sarah corrected with a smile. You performed medicine. Human, alien, primitive, advanced. These are just labels. What matters is that you did what needed to be done. That's what makes a true medical professional, regardless of species. Later, as Sarah filed her incident report, she added a personal note. Students demonstrated exceptional adaptation to emergency conditions. Previous cultural barriers to human medical techniques completely overcome when faced with genuine need. Recommendation: include more hands-on emergency scenarios in future curricula. Some lessons can only be truly learned in the field. The Academy Board would later mark this incident as a turning point in interspecies medical training. Sometimes it took a crisis to prove that the most basic methods could be the most reliable, and that what seemed primitive to one species could be the key to survival for all. 3 days after the engineering lab incident, the Galactic Medical Academy received an urgent distress call. A passenger transport had suffered a catastrophic systems failure during atmospheric entry, forcing an emergency landing at the Academy's auxiliary landing field. The vessel carried over 200 passengers of various species, and the Academy was the closest medical facility. Sarah Chun stood with her students in the Emergency Response Center, watching as the transport's trajectory data painted a grim picture on the holoscreen. The ship's medical bay had been destroyed during the descent, and their automated healing pods were offline. "This is what we've trained for," Sarah announced to her class. "We'll be working alongside the Academy's senior medical team, but they're understaffed for an incident of this magnitude. You're no longer students. Today, you're emergency responders. The transport's landing was more of a controlled crash, sending tremors through the Academy's foundations. Within minutes, the emergency response teams were mobilizing. Sarah's students moved with practiced efficiency, no longer showing any hesitation about implementing human emergency protocols. The landing field had become a makeshift triage center. The quantum hivemind representatives immediately established a coordination network, their multiple bodies organizing the incoming casualties by severity. Crix led a team of Zalaxians, their crystalline appendages glinting as they moved among the injured, applying pressure bandages and establishing forelines, a human medical technique they had once found horrifying. Multiple crushing injuries in Section C, Trinlocks called out, their exoskeleton now steady as they assessed a group of Centaurian passengers. "We need trauma teams here." Sarah worked alongside her students, proud to see them implementing their training without hesitation. The Morlock team had developed their own innovation, using their tentacles to maintain pressure on multiple wounds simultaneously while administering emergency medications. The Photarians had learned to modulate their bioluminescence to provide optimal lighting for different medical procedures. A senior medical officer, Dr. Ventar, approached Sarah as she finished stabilizing a patient. "Your students, they're using human emergency protocols. Without advanced medical tech, I feared we'd be overwhelmed, but they're actually keeping pace with our trauma teams. They've learned that sometimes the oldest methods are the most reliable," Sarah replied, moving to her next patient. "Watch." Nearby, a Viridian student was teaching a shocked Academy medic how to properly pack a wound with gauze. "Don't remove the soaked bandages," they explained, mandibles clicking confidently. "Add more on top." Yes, it seems counterintuitive, but trust me, this human technique works. The scene on the landing field was organized chaos. Teams of students worked alongside professional medics, their different anatomies and abilities combining in unexpected ways. The Quantum Hivemind's coordination network had evolved into an efficient triage system, prioritizing cases and directing resources with remarkable precision. "Instructor Chin," Crix called out urgently. "We have a draconid with severe internal bleeding. Their healing stasis pod is non-functional." Sarah rushed over, finding her students already preparing for emergency surgery. In the past, they would have been paralyzed by the prospect of such an invasive procedure. Now, they worked with calm efficiency, using modified human surgical techniques adapted for xenobiological anatomy. Blood pressure dropping, reported a Morlock, their tentacles monitoring multiple vital signs simultaneously. "Traditional draconid healing methods require equipment we don't have." "Then we do this the human way," Crix declared, their crystalline surface reflecting the emergency lights. "Manual vessel clamping and physical repair. It's crude, but it will keep them alive until we can get them to a proper medical facility." Hours passed in a blur of activity. The students moved from patient to patient, their previous revulsion at human medical practices completely forgotten in the face of necessity. They had learned to trust these methods, to understand that survival sometimes required getting their appendages dirty. By the time the last patient was stabilized, the landing field looked like a battlefield hospital from human history. Makeshift splints, pressure bandages, and emergency sutures were everywhere. But among the 200 passengers, not a single life had been lost. Dr. Ventar found Sarah again as the emergency teams began moving patients to permanent medical facilities. "I've been practicing medicine for 30 cycles," they admitted, "but I've never seen anything quite like this. Your students combined human emergency techniques with their own unique abilities in ways I wouldn't have thought possible." Sarah watched as her students helped transfer patients, still alert and focused despite their exhaustion. "That was the goal all along," she explained. "Not to make them abandon their own medical traditions, but to show them that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective. Human medicine isn't about having the most advanced technology, it's about doing whatever it takes to save lives." The quantum hivemind representatives approached, their primary consciousness nodes pulsing with accumulated data. Analysis complete, human emergency medical protocols demonstrated 94% effectiveness rate under current conditions. Conclusion: primitive methods contain sophisticated underlying principles. Recommendation: full integration into standard emergency response procedures. Sarah smiled, remembering how these same students had once shuddered at the thought of applying direct pressure to a wound. Now they were teaching others, innovating new techniques, and saving lives using methods their species had previously dismissed as barbaric. "You've all proved something today," she announced to her gathered students. Not just about human medicine, but about adaptability, about finding solutions in unlikely places. Remember this the next time someone tells you a method is too primitive or too crude. The only thing that matters is whether it works. The Academy would later record this incident as one of the most successful mass casualty responses in its history. The techniques developed by Sarah's students would become standard protocol for emergency situations where advanced medical technology was unavailable or impractical. Sometimes it took a crisis to prove that progress didn't always mean moving forward. Sometimes it meant remembering what worked in the past. In the days following the transport crisis, the Galactic Medical Academy buzzed with activity. News of the successful emergency response had spread across the galaxy, and suddenly, Sarah Chen's class found themselves the subject of intense academic interest. Medical professionals from dozens of species were requesting information about their innovative combination of human emergency techniques with xenobiological capabilities. Sarah watched as her students participated in a panel discussion before a packed auditorium. The confidence they now displayed was a far cry from their initial horror at human medical practices just months ago. "The fundamental mistake," Crix explained to the audience, their crystalline form catching the light as they gestured, was dismissing human medical techniques as primitive simply because they didn't rely on advanced technology. "We failed to recognize that these methods were refined through millennia of practical application." The quantum hivemind representatives projected a holographic display of their collected data. Statistical analysis reveals that in crisis situations, reliability of basic physical intervention exceeds that of complex technological solutions by 23.7%. Failure points in advanced medical systems, power supply, calibration requirements, species-specific programming. Failure points in human techniques, virtually none. A distinguished Arcturian physician raised an objection from the audience. "But surely these methods cause unnecessary trauma? Our medical philosophy emphasizes minimal invasion and perfect harmony with natural healing processes." Trinlock stepped forward, their exoskeleton no longer rattling with anxiety, but gleaming with purpose. "With respect, Professor, I once shared your view. But what we've learned is that trauma itself isn't the enemy, death is. Sometimes, preventing death requires actions that seem aggressive or inelegant. Humans understood this long before they reached the stars." The Morlock team demonstrated their modified tentacle pressure technique, showing how they'd adapted human principles to their unique physiology. "We discovered that our traditional healing harmonies could be enhanced by direct physical intervention. The key was understanding that different approaches could complement each other rather than conflict." Sarah noted how the audience's reactions had shifted from initial skepticism to genuine interest. Even the most traditional medical practitioners were taking notes as her students explained their experiences. "Consider the human practice of wound packing," the Photarian student explained, their bioluminescent patterns forming educational displays. "We originally saw it as brutally invasive. Now we understand it as an elegant solution, using the body's own healing mechanisms, enhanced by simple physical support. In many ways, it's more sophisticated than our regeneration fields." An emergency response coordinator from a frontier colony raised their appendage. "But what about cultural sensitivity? Many species have strong taboos against physical contact with bodily fluids or internal organs." "Cultural sensitivity is important," Sarah interjected, stepping forward. "But in emergency medicine, the priority must be survival. What we've found is that most cultural taboos become flexible when lives are at stake. Our students haven't abandoned their cultural beliefs, they've expanded them to embrace new possibilities." The Viridian students shared their experience from the transport crisis. "We discovered that what seemed primitive actually required incredible precision and understanding of xenobiology. Applying human techniques to different species demanded more skill and knowledge than simply activating an automated healing pod. As the discussion continued, Sarah recognized a deeper transformation in her students. They weren't just defending human medical practices, they were advancing a new philosophy of emergency care that bridged the gap between technological sophistication and practical reliability. The true revelation, Crix concluded, wasn't just about medical techniques. It was about understanding that progress doesn't always mean greater complexity. Sometimes it means finding the essential principles that work across all species, all situations, all technological levels. The quantum hive mind added their consensus. Human medical practices represent an overlooked path of evolution, one that prioritized reliability and adaptability over technological advancement. This path deserves equal consideration in modern medical science. After the panel, Sarah found her students engaged in intense discussions with some of the galaxy's leading medical researchers. Proposals were being made for new hybrid training programs, combining advanced medical technology with human emergency techniques. "You've started something remarkable," Dr. Ventar told Sarah as they watched the interactions. "These students aren't just practicing human medicine, they're creating an entirely new approach to emergency care. One that takes the best from all our species." Sarah observed as Crix demonstrated proper pressure technique to a group of fascinated medical directors, while the Morlock team discussed their modified procedures with emergency response planners. The Photarians were consulting with xenobiologists about optimizing their bioluminescent assistance during critical procedures. "That was always the goal," Sarah replied. "Not to prove that human methods were superior, but to show that there's value in every approach. Sometimes we need quantum stabilization fields and neural regenerators. Sometimes we need bandages and direct pressure. True wisdom is knowing when to use each." The Academy board was already discussing curriculum changes, planning to incorporate these hybrid techniques into standard medical training. What had started as a controversial class in primitive human methods was evolving into a revolutionary approach to emergency medicine. Later that evening, Sarah found her students still deep in discussion about the future implications of their experiences. They were no longer simply students learning human techniques. They had become pioneers of a new medical philosophy that would influence emergency care across the galaxy. "We need to document everything," the quantum hive mind declared. "These procedures, these adaptations, this integration of approaches, it could save countless lives on frontier worlds, in crisis situations, anywhere advanced medical technology might fail." Sarah smiled, remembering their first class and the horror on their various alien faces. Now they were teaching others, advancing medical science in ways she hadn't anticipated. Sometimes the most significant breakthroughs came not from developing new technology, but from learning to appreciate the wisdom in what already worked. The graduation ceremony at the Galactic Medical Academy took place 6 months after the transport crisis. The grand ceremonial hall was filled with representatives from medical institutions across the galaxy, all eager to witness the graduation of the class that had revolutionized emergency medical training. Sarah Chen sat among the faculty, watching as her students prepared to receive their certifications. Each of them had changed profoundly from the hesitant aliens who had first entered her classroom, horrified at the thought of primitive, human medical techniques. The Academy's chancellor, a venerable Arcturian, addressed the assembled crowd. "Today marks not just the graduation of another class of medical professionals, but the beginning of a new era in galactic emergency medicine. These students have shown us that true medical wisdom lies not in the sophistication of our technology, but in our ability to save lives by any means necessary." Crix, chosen as the class spokesperson, approached the podium. Their crystalline form had developed new facets during their training, each one representing a lesson learned, a barrier overcome. "When we first began studying human emergency medicine, we thought we were learning about primitive survival techniques. What we actually learned was something far more valuable, the power of adaptability." The quantum hive mind representatives projected a series of images showing their class's journey, from their first squeamish attempts at bandaging to their confident handling of the transport crisis. Statistical conclusion: Integration of human emergency techniques with advanced medical technology increases survival rates by 47.3% in crisis situations. Human innovation, not measured by technological advancement, but by practical effectiveness. Sarah watched as each student received their certification. The Morlock team had written a groundbreaking thesis on adapting tentacle-based anatomy to human medical techniques. The Photarians had developed new protocols for using their bioluminescence in emergency surgery. Trinlocks had created a training program specifically designed to help exoskeleton-based species overcome their natural aversion to direct medical intervention. But perhaps our most important lesson, Crix continued, was understanding that progress doesn't always mean moving forward. Sometimes it means remembering what worked in the past. Humans didn't reach the stars with the most advanced technology. They got there through determination, adaptability, and the will to survive. The Viridian students had already accepted positions at frontier medical stations, where their combination of advanced knowledge and practical emergency skills would be most needed. The Quantum Hive Mind had been commissioned to create a comprehensive database of hybrid medical techniques, preserving this new knowledge for future generations. After the ceremony, Sarah found her students gathered in their old classroom one last time. The room still held the practice mannequins, the basic medical supplies, and the memories of their transformation from skeptical aliens to pioneering medical professionals. "I have something to show you," Sarah announced, activating the classroom's holographic display. Messages began appearing, hundreds of them, from medical facilities across the galaxy. "These are the initial reports from institutions that have implemented your hybrid techniques. Emergency response success rates are up everywhere. You've saved lives without even knowing it." The Photarians' bioluminescent patterns pulsed with pride. "We almost quit after that first class." The sight of human blood, the concept of physically manipulating wounds. "And now look at you," Sarah smiled. "Teaching others, developing new techniques, combining the best of all our medical traditions. You've proven that there's no such thing as primitive medicine, only medicine that works." Trinlox's exoskeleton gleamed in the classroom's light. "We've received offers from medical schools across the galaxy. They want us to establish similar programs to teach this new approach to emergency care. The galaxy is finally ready to learn what humans have known all along," Crix observed. "That sometimes the simplest solutions are the most reliable. That true medical skill isn't about having the most advanced technology, it's about being ready to save lives under any circumstances." The Quantum Hive Mind hummed thoughtfully. Query: did humans develop their emergency techniques because they were primitive, or were they successful because their techniques were fundamentally sound? Conclusion: human medical practices represent optimal evolution of emergency response protocols. As her students discussed their future plans, teaching positions, research projects, frontier assignments, Sarah reflected on their journey. They had come to her classroom expecting to study primitive survival techniques. Instead, they had discovered a fundamental truth about medicine, about progress, and about the nature of human ingenuity. "Remember," she told them, "wherever you go from here, whatever advanced medical technologies you work with, keep these basic skills sharp. Because somewhere, sometime, someone's life will depend not on the sophistication of your equipment, but on your willingness to do whatever it takes to save them." The students gathered their belongings, ready to depart for their new assignments across the galaxy. But they were taking with them more than just medical knowledge. They had learned the true essence of human emergency medicine, the understanding that when lives are at stake, there is no such thing as primitive or advanced, only what works and what doesn't. As they left the classroom for the last time, Sarah knew that their influence would ripple across the galaxy. Future generations of medical professionals would learn to combine the best of all approaches, to value reliability over sophistication, to understand that true progress sometimes meant rediscovering the wisdom of the past. The galaxy had dismissed humans as primitive Deathworlders who relied on crude medical techniques. Now they understood that those very techniques, refined through millennia of practical application, represented a different kind of advancement, one based not on technological sophistication, but on the fundamental principles of survival. adaptation, and the unwavering determination to save lives by any means necessary.